Hello, fellow listeners, and welcome back to Feel the Pedal podcast. This is episode number 12. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us, whether if you're in the car, at home, or just running outside, as I know some of you boys and girls do. Whether if it's at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or even YouTube, where you can also listen to your favorite episodes. This time I'm broadcasting from the lovely city of Barcelona, a short prelude before heading to Andorra and race in one of the most popular one-day cycling races in the Iberian Peninsula, L'Apurito, which was the nickname of Joaquin Rodriguez, the former Spanish pro cyclist. It's an 145k route where we'll climb something like 5,200 meters. No big deal, which is approximately 700 feet. So looking forward to that. And this is a land of cyclists. We're gonna go through some mountain passes usually featured in the Vuelta a España, such as Col de la Gallina, Col d'Ordino, Col de la Rabassa, and Collada de Beixalís. But enough about what I'm gonna do next Sunday. That doesn't matter. This is a season for celebration in the world of cycling.
But finally, viva Colombia! Viva Egan Bernal! Vive le Tour de France!
On Sunday, the 28th of July, Team Ineos' Egan Bernal became the third youngest rider in history and the first Colombian to win the Tour de France. But the 22-year-old wasn't the only one to have a fantastic tour. In addition to Bernal, the 2019 Tour produced another national hero. The Koenig Quick-Step's Julien Alaphilippe. Even in defeat, the Frenchman dominated this year's Tour, animating the race from start to finish by winning 2 stages and wearing the yellow jersey for 14 days total before cracking in the Alps. His aggression, perseverance, and panache will never be forgotten, especially taking into account that this season Alaphilippe has won Milan-San Remo, Strade Bianche, La Flèche Wallonne, got the mountains classification in the Criterion of Dauphiné with 2 stage wins, and made it top 10 in many other races this year. Jumbo-Visma had a fantastic tour, winning 4 stages and putting Steven Kruijswijk on the final podium in 3rd place. The Dutch outfit got off to a fantastic start, with Mike Teunissen winning a stage 1 and the team taking stage 2 team time trial, which it won comfortably over Ineos. Dylan Groenewegen and Wout van Aert each won stages before the first rest day, at which point the focus switched to Kruijswijk's overall ambitions. Wout van Aert suffered an unfortunate crash during the individual time trial that would take him out of this tour, but he sure left an excellent impression for his first ever appearance in a World Tour race. Hopefully Wout recovers fast from his injury. Another fellow knight that was having a tremendous performance during this year's Tour edition is, of course, Thibaut Pinot, who for the second time in 2 years went from the verge of Grand Tour podium finish to an early departure. After winning stage 14 atop of the Tourmalet and finishing second 1 day later at the Prat d'Albis, the Frenchman looked like the strongest rider in the race and the man most likely to win his country its first Tour since 1985. But then came the sudden abandonment on stage 19, which caught everyone completely by surprise. The image of Pinot in tears abandoning the race was truly an emotional sight to many cycling fans, myself included. To Monsieur Thibaut Pinot, I say chapeau, you have nothing else to prove and you've made cycling and France proud. May you have a fast recovery. And last but not least, Bora Hansgrohe Peter Sagan quietly won his 7th green jersey in 8 tours raced, a new record. In all, the Slovak scored 9 top 5 stage finishes, including his victory on stage 5 in Colmar. I think many people would agree that this edition of the Tour de France was one of the most exciting and unpredictable in many, many years. So, on to the topic that brings you all here today. Today we're here to talk about exogenous ketone supplementation and its possible effect on exercise performance. A very hot topic at the moment, particularly since it has been recently on the media that pro cycling teams have been using them during this edition of the Tour de France. So, such a specific topic requires an inside man, someone who has been directly involved in some of the research performed in this area so far. Dr. Mark Evans. Mark is a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Agriculture and Food Science at University College Dublin, currently working on personalized nutrition. He received his master's degree in sports nutrition from Liverpool John Moores University in 2015. His PhD research focused on the effect of exogenous ketone supplementation on physical and cognitive performance in athletes. Mark has worked as a consultant in elite sport with the Leinster Rugby Sub-Academy and the Football Association of Ireland, where he was responsible for overseeing and development of a sports nutrition program for youth and senior national teams. So, what are exogenous ketones? What is the difference in doing a ketogenic diet and providing ketones exogenously? What forms of ketones do we have available so far? Does the current research support the claims we have been hearing? What promise is there for this area of research? All this and a bit more on episode 12 of Fuel the Pedal podcast. Hi Mark, it's so good to have you here with us. How's everything in Ireland?
All good here in Ireland. Thanks very much for having me.
Pleasure to have you on, Mark. So, for listeners who might not know you, could you tell us who exactly is Mark Evans and what has he been up to in the past years?
Sure. So I guess I would be a sports nutritionist. So I did my undergraduate degree in University College Dublin. I then went on to specialise in sports nutrition. So I did my master's in Liverpool John Moores University. So then it was during that time that I actually went back and did my summer thesis back in Dublin with Dr. Brendan Egan. And then from that then we started my PhD research in Dublin City University on ketones. So alongside like my academic background, I've worked as a sports nutritionist consultant with the Leinster Rugby, so the academy and sub-academy sides, and then also with the Football Association of Ireland. So whereas my academic background is kind of a mix between, I guess, endurance and team sports, my practical experience is mostly with in team sport settings. So that's kind of my academic and practical background.
Great. And so the research you've been performing in the last years has been based on ketone metabolism, right?
Yeah. So I published as part of publishing a couple of papers early on caffeine chewing gum and protein hydrolysis, but it was really when we started looking into whole exogenous ketone area that things kicked into gear for me, research and publication wise. So I started that in 2015, my PhD with Dr. Brendan Egan. It was on a bit of a whim, really, that we chose that topic. I was very lucky where I got to choose my own PhD topic. We just sat down and Brendan had heard about these ketone supplements maybe being used by, Olympians in 2012 or in the Tour de France. But there was obviously a complete lack of published literature in the area. So that was kind of our impetus to say, well, if there's nothing out there, there must be some reason why these professional teams or organizations are using it to, whether it's to enhance performance or to enhance recovery or adaptation, or we had no idea what they were using it for. So we decided there was no better people really than to kind of get a hold of it and make our own data and try and see what was going on.
Yeah, great. And I'm really happy you chose that topic because otherwise we wouldn't be here today talking about this. And this deserves a lot of attention right now, especially because it's a topic that everyone is talking about right now in social media, on the internet around exogenous ketones. And we can read online cycling magazines that riders from several teams are taking them. Even folks on the Global Cycling Network YouTube channel dedicated a video recently to exogenous ketones. And so I thought it would be a good idea to bring someone who has been passing a lot of time researching on this, and this has been part of Mark's PhD. So as in everyone engaged in a PhD, it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? It's our life. It's all we see. So it's really, really good to have Mark here with us to share his expertise. So, and since there's already a lot of confusion in people's minds around this and everything involving ketosis and keto dieting, and now all of a sudden some listeners probably starting to hear that exogenous ketones are being used during the Tour de France, I believe it would be a good starting point to define what exactly are ketone bodies, probably getting into more detail on the main differences between diet-induced ketosis and the ingestion of exogenous ketones, what are the conditions that will be required to induce this ketone body provision or production, and what is the advantage of providing exogenous ketone. And what blood markers should we expect to see elevated to identify this endogenous ketone production?
So that's definitely a good starting off point. And I mean, I think we need to say thanks to Lance Armstrong for kind of bringing a whole load of new eyes to this area with his podcast. I think it was only last week. So it's definitely a good time to hit this topic. So I think, first of all, I think we need to kind of define exactly what we're talking about here. Physiologically, what are ketone bodies and where do they come from and how are they produced? So we produce three ketone bodies. So we have beta hydroxybutyrate, or as I'll refer to it from now on, probably just BHB. Mm-hmm. We have acetoacetate, and then we also have acetone. So these ketone bodies are produced by the liver. And I guess what we're mainly talking about in terms of endogenous or diet-induced ketosis is we're looking for a decrease in carbohydrate availability. Now, there's different ways that can be achieved. Whether that's through fasting, it could be overnight fasting, prolonged fasting, and then going on into starvation, or what's most appropriate or applicable to athletes, it would be a high-fat ketogenic diet, or what most people have heard of ketosis in relation to. So again, is what we would call, I guess, endogenous ketosis or diet-induced ketosis. Now, metabolically, what we see along with that is we see an increase in free fatty acid availability. So these fatty acids are transported from the adipose tissue to the liver, and then they go through the ketogenic pathway. And then we firstly get acetoacetate, and this is then converted to BHB, and they're then shuttled in the circuit to normally glucose-dependent organs. So again, we're talking about decreased carbohydrate availability. So our organs, like our brain, our skeletal muscle, our heart, are normally dependent on glucose for fuel. So in this situation, we have reduced carbohydrate availability, and these ketones are replacing glucose as a source of fuel for those organs. Now, where ketogenic supplements, exogenous ketones, come in is that we're basically skipping that whole left side, our whole kind of liver producing side. So when we take in exogenous ketones, we don't have to reduce our carbohydrate availability to increase our BHB levels in our blood. So they come straight out of the gut into the circulation, and then hopefully they're going to our skeletal muscle, if again we're focusing on athletes and exercise, and potentially being used as a fuel. So in terms of the difference between exogenous and endogenous ketosis. With endogenous, again, we have reduced carbohydrate availability. We have an increase in free fatty acid availability, decrease in insulin, and an increase in glucagon. Whereas with exogenous, we still have full carbohydrate availability. So along with that, then we still have elevated insulin levels, we get a decrease in free fatty acids, and we get and our glucagon levels stay low. So those are the main kind of metabolic milieu results or differences between those two states. Now, in terms of BHB concentrations, postprandial concentrations, you're probably talking 0.1 millimolar BHB. Overnight fasted, you might get up to 0.3, 0.4 millimolars BHB. And then, over several weeks, that might increase on a ketogenic diet or endogenous ketosis up to 1. And then we might see actually a gradual decrease back to kind of baseline levels. Whereas with exogenous, we get a sharp increase in BHB levels. Now, that's going to differ on the supplement that you use, but if we're going to focus on, let's say, the BHB monoester, in a fasted state, you can get up to anywhere between 4 to 6 millimolar even after 20 to 30 minutes after ingestion. So it really is, in terms of the BHB response and the acuteness, it's kind of chalk and cheese between the two. So there definitely is a lot of confusion out there in terms of, if one is bad for athletic performance, how could one be good? And the reason is because, the whole pathway is different.
Yeah, great. That's just perfect to provide the context for our listeners. So the advantage of exogenous ketones would be, to provide this elevation in BHB levels without having to go through keto dieting or starvation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's and obviously in not even in elite athletes, in any kind of athletic population, prolonged fasting or starvation, or I guess a bit more controversial, but a high fat ketogenic diet probably aren't going to do the job for you. So it's getting that elevation in BHB while still having the carbohydrate to maintain performance.
Perfect, Mark. And in the available research so far, some of that performed by your research group along with Dr. Brendan Egan, there are some different levels of circulating BHB, aren't they, with different exogenous ketone supplements? I think perhaps it would be interesting to get into the pharmacokinetics of BHB, for example. What would be the ideal range, if there is any ideal range of circulating BHB, and what quantities of different formulas are required to get into such range? For example, how long should we expect ketone bodies, in this case BHB, to remain elevated, for example?
Yeah, so in terms of an ideal range, I guess we don't really know if there is an ideal range yet. In our literature review that was published in Physiology probably two or 3 years ago now, we hypothesized what could be an ideal range, and what that was based on was studies going back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where the kinetics of ketone bodies in exercise were studied in participants that were fasted for different lengths, and then later on they were infused with ketone bodies. And so the typical kind of the study that we're looking at is, infusing people with ketones, putting them through an exercise bout, maybe 60% of VO2 max for 1 or 2 hours, seeing how much ketones are taken up by the muscle and used by the muscle. So from those studies, we got our 1 to 3 millimolar. That's what we hypothesized, and what that's based on is that, let's say, below 1 millimolar, the contribution of ketones to total energy provision is very low, maybe something like 2 to 3%. So at a threshold of 1, we're hoping that it's going to be larger than that anyway. And then above 3, what happens that if we go above 3 millimolar into the 4 to 5 millimolar range, that you actually get a saturation of the muscle uptake of ketones. So the muscle doesn't take any more in. So that's why we decide on 1 to 3. So it's above 1 millimolar, so you can actually get an increase in provision of ketone bodies towards energy, but not too high, so you're blunting the muscle uptake of ketones. So it's not always more is better.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, although we don't know what the exact range is, we hypothesized, as you've mentioned, we know that above 4, it's not a good idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if the model used was endogenous ketosis or exogenous, but I guess in this case, we're talking about exogenous through infusions. So with endogenous, yeah, I think once you get up to the 4 or 5 millimolar range, you're getting a saturation of the muscle of uptake. Now, with exogenous ketosis, when you stimulate the uptake of ketones with exercise at those levels, you still do get a minor drop, and this minor drop then kind of stimulates the uptake further. So again, the difference there is a difference between the two models, but in terms of setting the 3 millimolar threshold, I mean, that it could turn out that that's too low. I mean, we came up with that hypothesis, 6 months, a year into looking into this topic. Now, it hasn't been disproven yet, so who knows? It might hold up, and that might be the ideal range. But yeah, it was really just looking at the kinetics from studies in the 70s and 80s that led us to that.
Yeah, and for what we can see from the evolution of research throughout the years, research started with ketone salts, and then other forms were created, such as ketone esters like ketone monoester and acetoacetate diester, and we even see many brands commercializing them. I'm curious to get into the main differences between each one of them, particularly the possible negative issues we often hear about, such as taste and GI symptoms.
Yeah, so I guess this is where we should probably break up the term exogenous ketones into the different supplements. At the moment, I guess what's most commercially available are the ketone salts. Probably the most amount of companies are producing them at the moment. So what they are is just a BHB molecule that's attached to a mineral salt. So it could be calcium, sodium, potassium, or a mixture in the powder. So again, they come in powder form. So with 1 to 2 servings of those ketone salts, you're probably going to get into the range of about 0.4 to 0.6 millimolar. So you are talking, maybe a 5 to 6 times increase over your levels if you're walking around. But in terms of our 1 to 3 millimolar threshold, you're not quite getting there. With the BHB monoester then, again, we just have a BHB molecule attached to a ketone body precursor. So in this case, that's a butanediol. So when we compare that to the BHB salt, we see like a much greater increase in BHB levels after we ingest it. So in the fastest state, you can get up to, like I was saying, about 4 to 6 millimolar 20 to 30 minutes after you ingest it. Now, that's in the fastest state. Now, in terms of the fed state, you're maybe looking at 2 to 3 millimolar, so about maybe a 33% to almost a 50% reduction in the BHB levels. And then on the other hand, we have our acetoacetate diester, just to make it a little bit more complicated. So this is these are acetoacetate molecules, and they get you into a similar range as the salts. So that's why I guess in presentations I've actually tried to group the salts and the diester, the acetoacetate diester together, just because we get a similar BHB response somewhere between 0.4 to 0.6 millimolar, and it's with those two supplements that we seem to get the higher incidences of gastrointestinal distress. So, and then with the Lecky papers, that's still the only human paper we have with that supplement. I think it was every single writer nominated their impaired performance was because of their GI distress. So there are still issues to work around with probably every single one of these supplements in terms of whether it is the taste across the board, or whether it's GI distress specifically with the BHB monoester.
Have you ever tasted them, Mark? How would you describe the taste?
Well, like people might be surprised that I've only ever really tasted or finished a full serving of the early stage BHB salts. So even though we have tested quite a lot with the ketone aid and the human ketone ester, I've never quite been able to get over the early pilot testing PTSD of trying out the early ketones.
Okay, good for you, Mark, because the way I hear it, the taste is not that great, but improving. So you've briefly mentioned something important there that I think it might be interesting to emphasize. So taking exogenous ketones in the fasted versus in the fed state might actually influence its pharmacokinetics. Is there a difference between both states in BHB concentrations?
I think it's important if you go back and look at the Cox paper, the original paper that was published in Metabolism. They showed that in the fastest state, with I think it was the 573 milligrams per kg body mass dose, they got up to about 6 millimolar in the rested fastest state. And then it was later on, it was one of Brianna's on the Metabolism paper, where she showed that feeding blunted the peak BHB concentrations. I think it was by a third. Now that could be important in terms of our hypothesized threshold of 1 to 3 millimolar in terms of getting athletic populations into that range. And it's also important to consider because every athlete is going to have, probably a high carbohydrate breakfast in the, 3 to 4 hours before exercise. So, and just like we're saying with the endogenous ketosis, it's not really practical to start a very long, if we're talking about cycling, like a very long, let's say Tour de France stage up to 200 kilometers on a fasted empty stomach, just so you can try to get higher BHB that might not actually improve your performance anyway.
Yes, and that's exactly the point I was trying to make with my question. If athletes are, in this case cyclists, are to obtain the benefits from exogenous ketone ingestion during a competition such as the Tour de France, the most likely scenario is that these athletes are fully carb loaded every day, whereas it could perhaps be different from a training-like scenario where cyclists can perform many control sessions in the fasted state. Is this accurate, Mark?
Yeah, for sure. And it's also important to take into account, the length of those stages. So you were asking about, how long are these supplements? How long is BHB actually going to stay up because of these supplements? And I guess across the board in the studies, we're only really using exercise bouts of 1 to 2 hours, let's say, so maximum 120 minutes, whereas those stages are much longer. Now, what we see in the studies is that if you take in the dosing strategies being used at the moment, that your BHB levels will stay elevated throughout exercise, for, I guess, the amount of exercise that most people are going to be doing. So I guess we don't know yet if you were taking ketones before, let's say, a Tour de France stage that's going to last maybe 4 to 5 hours, what kind of dosing strategy or how long those BHB levels will actually stay elevated alongside exercise.
Perfect, and hopefully we can get into more detail on what the exact context in which ketone supplementation might be of benefit in cycling. But before going there, we see a lot of devices available on Amazon to quickly measure ketone levels through breath, blood, and urine. What would you make of these? Are they reliable?
To be honest, like your best option if you're taking in an exogenous ketone supplement, if you really want to check your ketone levels, is to use a handheld. If you want to use a handheld measurement, that's your best option. So in terms of the breath, what you're actually measuring there is acetone, but that's not really involved in what we're talking about. The urine measurement I haven't actually come across too often, and I haven't really seen it used in research to actually get a reliable measure of, let's say, what's actually circulating in the blood. But I couldn't imagine it would be too reliable. So if you're looking for kind of a quick, easy to use method to measure your ketones after you take one of these in, and a handheld measurement is probably the way to go. Except the only thing that you need to be cognizant of with a handheld measure is that what I've come across in terms of the animal and also human research so far, the handheld measures tend to overestimate BHB levels if you're then comparing them to like a laboratory gold standard, let's say, measurement of plasma or serum concentrations of BHB. So when we look at the Lecky paper on the acetoacetate diester, if we measure it in serum or plasma, BHB is in, I think, the 0.4 range. But when it was measured in whole blood, I think they were measuring levels of up to 1.4 or 1.5 millimolar. So I think that's something to be cognizant of as well, that if you're taking a ketone salt and your BHB levels are, getting up to 0.7 millimolar, that might actually be an overestimation of what they actually are. I have never collected samples from people and compared the methods at the same time points, if you get me. So that's just what I've taken out of what I've seen in the literature so far.
Okay, great. Would you agree, Mark, that in a context like a multi-stage race like the Tour de France, where carbohydrate provision needs to be high at all times, and this is the $1 million question that everyone wants to hear and everyone has its notes ready now. In your opinion, as someone who's been deeply researching on exogenous ketone supplementation in the last years, is the research available so far robust enough to say that can they provide some benefit? And let's use here the example of road cycling, the Tour de France right now, a multi-stage race. And for example, with comparing with a radically opposed type of effort, such as a sprint in track cycling, what would you make of this?
Yeah, a lot of questions there. I guess I touched on it a little bit before, and it's probably good to emphasize here, is that, and you said it there, is that when you're talking about sustaining high intensity performance, whether it's in a Tour de France like a multi-stage race, or let's say Premiership football performance, high intensity intermittent performance, carbohydrate is king, So I guess what needs to be teased out of the literature is adding ketones to carbohydrate, beneficial? Does it improve performance more than taking in the same amount of carbohydrate alone? Because if it isn't, then there's not really much point spending a lot of money on something that you're not going to use. So short answer, at the moment, does the research lend itself to actually really saying, okay, this is going to improve someone's performance in a Tour de France like stage? I would say at the moment, probably not. So I guess if we look at the entire body of evidence, At the moment, I would say that the use of exogenous ketones or the BHB monoester in like a Tour de France at the moment is probably a little bit premature. You know, we really only have one study that's shown a performance improvement in a 30-minute maximal distance time trial. So that was by the Oxford group. So apart from that, you know, our work has shown, one of our studies was in a high intensity intermittent sport, which showed a possible impairment of performance. But if I were going to be working with a team and looking at the whole body of evidence at the moment, I think I would probably be looking at is everything else in place in terms of carbohydrate provision that would possibly enhance performance before looking at the ketones at the moment. Now that might change. For all I know, these teams might have their own data, and if they have the budget to pair their own data with what they think is going to improve performance or recovery, I'm not going to stand in their way. They can do whatever they want. But just from what I have access to, I would say, I mean, the area is in such an early stage. I mean, we only have maybe 10 studies across 3 different supplements that I think need to be grouped and compared to studies of just those types. So yeah, for me, it's probably a little bit early.
Oof, you've just disappointed so many people right now. Yeah, and we'll soon get into the whole debate of glycogen sparing versus glycogen impairing as possible mechanisms for this. But before we get into that, just to make things clear here, we are both nutritionists, and through our practice, we know how is the normal chronological cycle of most dietary supplements and how they came to be. They were first commercialized based on none or some inconclusive research, and only then, probably a decade after that, that's when they became the research became more robust for setting them as beneficial or non-beneficial. Would you say that with exogenous ketones we are still on that phase right now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Brendan, I remember used the analogy of carbohydrate provision studies, that go back to, the 1967 Bergman paper where they're looking at carbohydrate loading and does that improve performance? And, so however long ago that is, my maths isn't great. But, there's still research going on now into the optimal carbohydrate intake during exercise or during recovery. So we're talking about, 50, almost 50 years of research there. Now, the research on exogenous ketones performance has only been going on since 2016. So that's, almost only 4 years. So we really are still in the early stages. Now, it's also important that, sports supplements don't get that long anymore to make their mark. If 3 or 4 more studies come out that say that exogenous ketones don't improve performance in contexts where we probably don't expect it to improve performance, like high intensity intermittent activity, people might even just stop doing this work. People almost have to make hay and try to design the best studies possible, not to like bias it and try to say, this is exactly how exogenous ketones this is the only, way they can work, so we're going to design our study like that. But there has to be a mechanistic design of the study, and in terms of this, it would be great to see people doing like longer exercise bouts with highly trained participants, and really try and make the early work on ketones as impactful as possible, so we can then build on that later on.
Yes, totally agree, Mark. And what would you say that we see such conflicting results, as you've mentioned? Considering the studies performed so far in cycling, for example, in the Lakis paper in 2017, they provided 500 milligrams per kilo and found a performance impairment of 2% in a 31 time trial in a carbohydrate-fed state, with BHB reaching approximately 1 millimolar. In the Cox paper in 2016, they provided, 573 milligrams per kilo and found a performance enhancement of 2% more distance in a 30-minute time trial, with BHB concentrations now reaching 2 to 3 millimolar, while other studies with ketone salts from Roger and O'Malley found no differences in performance and even a performance impairment in the O'Malley study, with BHB concentrations ranging from 0.6 to 0.8 respectively. Now, taking this into account, could we perhaps say that The differences observed in these trials may be due to not reaching the optimal levels of BHB necessary to induce such benefits. How can the research performed so far or in other sports help us explain these results in your experience?
So I think the main difference, like I touched on before, between the Lecky and the Cox paper is the type of supplement used, like you're saying, the acetoacetate diester in the Lecky paper and the BHB monoester in the Cox paper. Now, I think the performance impairment in the Lecky study there, yes, they didn't get very high BHB levels, but I think the main confounder there was the GI distress. So, that can't be discounted in terms of the 2% performance impairment in that study. Now, when we're looking at the ketone salt papers, yes, again, we're not getting up to that 1 millimolar possible threshold that we hypothesized. But again, a lot of those studies were in short duration, high intensity performance. So again, something that we wouldn't typically think adding ketones to carbohydrate would improve. I mean, a 4-minute maximal cycling test, it's probably not even really carbohydrate dependent. So could it be ketone dependent? I don't know. So I guess looking through all these studies, and this goes for ketone research, but it also goes for any kind of sports nutrition research you're going to read. What is the supplement that they're taking in? Is it the acetoacetate diester? Is it the monoester? Is it the salts? And does it actually cause the physiological response that you want it to? So are we getting that BHB response up? So in the studies with the salts, we're not really getting the BHB range up. And again, I would say, those studies use a whole blood measurement for BHB. So I think those levels are actually a little bit exaggerated or a little bit higher than they actually were. And again, like I touched on before, what's the type of, what's the actual performance test that we're using? Is it a short duration? Is it long duration? Even when in our work, when we did get into the desired range, I think in the soccer study, we got up to about 2.5 millimolar. And then in our 10K paper that's just coming out at the moment, we only got up to about 1.3 millimolar, and that's using a similar dosing strategy to the Cox paper. But we didn't see an improvement in performance in those studies either. So I guess it's hard to ascertain really whether you do really need to get into that 1 to 3 millimolar range for a performance test that's going to last less than an hour.
Yes, and it's interesting because we can carefully design a study, as you've mentioned, with the conditions where ketones might actually have an important role. But then if there is gastrointestinal distress, then directly we see a performance decrement that may not necessarily be from ketone metabolically impairing performance, but because they may induce gastrointestinal distress. How often do we see these symptoms appear, Mark, and why do they appear?
So in terms of the gastrointestinal distress, when you increase the dose higher, we get a higher incidence. So with our salt study, we gave 2 servings of the ketone salts an hour prior to exercise. And I think I had about 13 out of 19 participants having incidences of nausea, of diarrhea, of vomiting. So, things that aren't really going to be helping your Tour de France cycling performance. Same thing with the acetoacetate diester. I think it was every single cyclist nominated those symptoms, like I said before, to impair the performance. So those 2 supplements, that's the trouble with those supplements, is that we're not getting the BHB response high enough with the dosing, that's already a little bit too high that's causing the GI distress. So those 2 supplements there's going to need to be some development, let's say, to reduce those instances. The BHB monoester seems to be better tolerated. We still did have a slightly higher incidence compared to just carbohydrate delivery alone. I think we were giving between 1 to 2 liters of carbohydrate, like a Lucozade-like drink during exercise. In terms of mechanism, it's probably likely to do with like a kind of osmotic diarrhea effect, maybe, like just kind of a high osmotic load in the stomach, kind of drawing the water into the gut. And then obviously you're going to have diarrhea. It could be due to the taste or how the taste used to be with those supplements. Those would be my 2 guesses. I don't have any kind of concrete data on it, but that would be my guess.
We've touched on this topic of gastrointestinal distress with Jamie Pugh previously here on the podcast, and this can really be a problem, because this can even affect the cyclist. Just the fact of thinking about it, if they know that this is probably going to cause some GI distress, he will get conditioned even before feeling those symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, I think the human brand, I know that Brianna had a paper recently in IGS NEM that actually did look at the differences between carbohydrate alone versus carbohydrate plus the BHB monoester, and the differences in GI distress actually wasn't that much different between the two. So I think the BHB monoester is definitely better tolerated than the salt or the diester. But I think another interesting thing, and I'm sure maybe this is what Jamie was talking about, maybe in terms of gut training. So in terms of glucose fructose ingestion, gut training could be a useful strategy to try and use. Could that be useful for ketones? Possibly. I haven't seen any research on it. I haven't really actually heard anyone really talking about it that much. It's so that could be interesting. But if you're going to try and train your gut, I guess it's going to be costly at the moment.
Yes,
given
it will be a very expensive gut training.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's at the moment, the ester is going to cost you more than a bottle of Lucozade. So it's going to be costly.
Yeah. So, talking about this, it's inevitable to get into the good old debate of the effects of exogenous ketone supplementations during exercise being whether glycogen impairing or glycogen sparing via pyruvate dehydrogenase and phosphofructokinase inhibition in the glycolytic pathway. What would you lean towards in this discussion, Mark?
I think I was saying to you before, I think I lean directly on the fence at the moment anyway. Mostly because I guess when we're talking about terms like sparing or impairing, it's kind of implying that it's one or the other. Glycogen sparing is the exact same as glycogen impairing mechanistically. I guess what's important is, can that effect, whether it's sparing or impairing, be overcome later in exercise? So let's just call it impairing. So if you impair carbohydrate utilization through PDH or PFK early on in exercise by taking in a ketone supplement, you're sparing exercise, and then hopefully, the aim is then to use this, let's say, during mountain climbs, hill climbs, or sprint finish, so you're getting an advantage that way. And what's interesting looking at the research is, and our research as well, and it's something that I've not regretted, but I would probably change about our work, is the actual dosing strategy that we've used. I think the mechanism is pretty well established. I think, the Stellingworth paper and the Havemann paper, looking at endogenous ketosis and how that impairs PDH PFK activity. I think they've put the mechanism forward pretty well, that increase in ketone levels will impair glycolysis. Now, what's interesting then with exogenous ketosis is our dosing strategy was half of our full dose before exercise, and then we split up the other half throughout exercise. So to me, that would actually suggest that we were potentially impairing glycogen use throughout exercise. So could there actually be some benefit to just completely front loading your ketones before exercise, impairing glycogen use, and then increasing IMTG use, and all those other kind of, let's say, benefits, and increase in ketone use early on in exercise. And then, later on in exercise, when your ketone levels are low, you're then relieving that impairment of glycolysis. And then you could then use that for the later stages of a race. Again, I don't know how, let's say, these Tour de France teams are using the supplements at the moment. But I'd be interested to hear if they're kind of following a similar dosing strategy that we did, or whether they're front loading, because I think that could possibly give it a better chance of working.
Yes, and this is also the idea of periodizing carbohydrate and fat intake on cyclists that research seems to support right now. When we are comparing what happens with providing ketones and engaging into a ketogenic type diet, I would see a carbohydrate suppressive effect in the latter rather than a carbohydrate sparing effect, because all you are doing is suppressing the enzymes involved in carbohydrate oxidation, pyruvate dehydrogenase being one of them, the main one actually, I think. You can suppress this enzyme within 24 hours of restricting carbohydrate, but you can also switch it back on quite quickly as long as you haven't suppressed it for too long of a period. But if you go on a high-fat diet for 5, 6, 7 days, even if you carbohydrate load for 24 hours after that, you can't restore your capacity to fully oxidize carbohydrate because the damage has already been done, sort of saying. And so is this mechanism different when providing exogenous ketones?
I guess it's hard to say because we don't actually have, let's say, the muscle data and the from, let's say, the glycolytic pathway to actually make a definitive statement about that. Now, in terms of endogenous ketosis, where you're restricting carbohydrate for, throughout your training period, let's say, and then racing, and you're trying to then ingest carbohydrate to get that flux going again through the pathway. Yeah, I think that can probably be termed carbohydrate impairing, mainly because then you're still not able to use the carbohydrate that you're ingesting. Whereas then with exogenous ketosis, you're still fueling yourself throughout the week and throughout training in your daily life with carbohydrate for energy. So you probably shouldn't get that impairment of glycolysis that you would get with endogenous ketosis. So I guess, in terms of exogenous ketosis, so using supplements, the term glycogen sparing and impairing, I think is a little bit of a misnomer, because you can impair it for a time. But if that impairing can be overcome later on in exercise, then it's technically sparing, if you get me. So it's kind of one and the same. I think in this context.
Totally, Mark. Outstanding point you've raised there that will certainly get people into thinking twice about this sparing versus impairing, in which both might actually happen during the same bout of exercise. So moving on now from the performance enhancing to the possible effects on recovery. There has been some research of several aspects of recovery, such as glycogen resynthesis and the possible effect on mTOR signaling, and quite recently, possible effects on training-induced overreaching by Peter Haspel's group in the University of Leuven in Belgium. Could you perhaps get into more detail on this, and what are the possible mechanisms behind this?
Yeah, so mechanistically, we're going back to what are the actual physiological role of ketones. They are a starvation response, a survival mechanism during times of fasting, let's say, or famine times. So again, they're providing a source of fuel for normally glucose dependent organs. But what they're also doing is they're sparing protein release from the muscle, and they're also sparing free fatty acid release. So it's really kind of like a storage response that the body has to elevated levels of VHB and of ketones. So that would suggest that in let's say a post-exercise context, that yes, you might be able to increase glycogen synthesis, increase protein synthesis. And when we look back at the literature from going back to the 80s and 90s, that ketone bodies do have an anti-catabolic effect. So they kind of attenuate leucine oxidation, and they can also increase muscle protein synthesis by up to 10% when elevated to 2 millimolar. So again, to concentrations that we would see with BHB monoester in ingestion. So when we look at the research, these two papers came out in quite close proximity to each other. So there were two papers looking at focusing on glycogen repletion after exercise. So in one of them, in the Holdsworth paper, they did find an increase in glycogen resynthesis, glycogen depleting bout of exercise. But I guess what's important in that study is that they used a hyperglycemic clamp and fed their ketone monoester at the end of the exercise bout. So when we use a hyperglycemic clamp, what we're doing is over I think it was a 2 or 3 hour recovery period, plasma glucose levels are set. So in this study, I think they were set between 11 and 12 millimolar, which is actually higher than we would see in just like a practically relevant scenario where athletes are just taking in, let's say, protein and carbohydrate drinks. So again, in this study, along with that kind of higher glucose concentrations, they observed almost a doubling in increased concentrations when the ketone monoester was added to the carbohydrate. And this then lent itself to an increase in glycogen resynthesis. Now, in the other paper, the difference between them is that the Van Dorn paper used like a more practically relevant model of recovery. So they actually added the ketone ester to a carbohydrate protein recovery drink. I think plasma glucose levels got up to about 7 or 8 millimolar. So, a fair bit lower than in the study that actually saw an effect. And there's no difference in insulin and no difference in glycogen repletion. Again, so we have kind of a difference between studies here in terms of glycogen repletion after exercise, but the one employing, let's say, the more practically relevant situation didn't find an effect. So that's more the side that I would be leaning towards at the moment in terms of glycogen synthesis.
Allow me to get into the equation, the cost again, because we are talking here about the possible effects of using ketones versus the traditional nutritional recovery strategies using plain carbohydrates and protein. How cost effective is this refueling with ketones? High enough to even consider it comparing it to the traditional way?
Yeah, I would say again, based on the two studies that we have at the moment, it probably isn't the most cost effective strategy. Now it's even if we do get an increase, let's say in muscle glycogen concentrations over that short recovery bout, ultimately it's going to depend on when is your next competition? Like, do you actually require a really sharp increase in glycogen levels? Are you competing in the next 8 hours, or is your next competitive bout 24 hours away? Because if it's 24 hours or more away, you can probably get away with just employing a normal carbohydrate and protein recovery strategy, and then topping up your levels, as you go through the day. So that would probably be my opinion on that. All right.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for clarifying that, Mark. Some of your research that I found particularly interesting is the one you've performed with team sports athletes in a Loughborough intermittent shuttle test while doing a cognitive test. And perhaps could you tell us a little bit more about this cognitive test battery that you've used, the amount of ketone esters provided, the circulating BHB concentration that you've reached with your subjects, and why was there no improvement in exercise performance, but there was an attenuation in the decline in executive function after exercise?
Sure. So the cognitive test that we use, it's a basic like iPad based cognitive test. So we had guys come in, they did a battery of 3 cognitive tests. So it was a reaction test, a decision making task, and sustained attention. So they did that before exercise, and then they underwent a 75-minute intermittent running protocol and then a volitional run to exhaustion. And then straight away, they underwent the exact same battery of tests. So we then compared the results of those tests from a carbohydrate alone strategy, fueling during exercise, and then adding ketone monoester onto the same amount of carbohydrate. Now, in terms of the exercise performance in that study, yeah, we actually saw a possible impairment in running performance in a short duration 4 to 6 minute run to exhaustion. But I think what's kind of missed a lot of the time in that study is that over the course of 75 minutes, 15-meter sprint performance wasn't different between trials. Now, if you ask me which one is actually more representative of soccer performance throughout a game, it's that and not the 4 to 6 minute performance test. But that's just a separate point, really. Now, in terms of the cognitive effects, we found nothing in terms of the reaction test and the sustained attention, but we did see a preservation of cognitive function in the ketone ester arm of that trial. So it might seem a little bit pedantic, but it wasn't an improvement in performance. It's just that in the ketone arm, they didn't get any worse, whereas that in the carbohydrate arm, they did get worse in one of our measures. So it's, kind of trying to make a little bit more sense of it, because ketones, their main physiological role is as a source of fuel for the brain. Our brain is glucose dependent. It's highly metabolically active and energy demanding. So if we go through like a starvation period and we lower our glucose levels, that fuel has to be replaced from somewhere. So there's been a lot of research in the last few years in terms of using ketone supplements in animal models, and kind of more recently in human models in using like radial maze tasks in rats, or looking at decision making in our study. But then also, interestingly, kind of using it to measure cognitive performance in clinical populations where cognitive performance is impaired, so on things like Alzheimer's. So really, in terms of our sports performance, we're looking at if we are using a lot of carbohydrate during exercise and reducing, let's say, maybe the availability of carbohydrate for the brain, could possibly ketones be used to compensate for that? Now, there's a lot of kind of to and fro. There's a lot of kind of stuff going on there, because we were making sure that our participants were, carbohydrate loaded. We fed them the day before and on the morning and afternoon before they came in. We fed optimal, let's say, carbohydrate-based fueling during the exercise bout. So were they fully carbohydrate depleted to actually get that, to get a meaningful effect because of the ketones? I mean, the results are there. I'm not too sure, because in our most recent study, we didn't see any effect in our reaction test or decision-making task. So all of those things still need to be teased out of the literature as well. So there is a mechanism there, and we did see an effect in one marker in a decision-making task. But that decision-making is only one aspect of a whole different processes when it comes to cognitive function. And again, our cognitive tests were iPad-based. So how representative is that, post-exercise of decisions that athletes are going to have to make in a game? So it'd be great to see, the addition of a ketone ester, people actually doing soccer specific things. So, there's the Loughborough intermittent the Loughborough intermittent passing test and the shooting test. So it'd be really interesting to see more game specific or sport specific measures of cognitive performance or skill performance.
And just before starting to wrap up here, Mark, what would you say about the possible effect of ketone bodies, whether through a ketogenic diet, whether from exogenous ketones on appetite regulation? I am referring, of course, to Brianna Stubbs' research on ketone ester supplementation on markers of appetite regulation. It was an acute study. What would you say that we have enough evidence to say that supplementing with ketones might provide this extra benefit of contributing to regulate appetite and therefore calorie ingestion when used, for example, in periods of calorie restriction in cycling or when trying to get in racing weight?
Yeah, so in terms of ketogenic dieting, I think it's definitely an effective weight loss strategy, and whether it's acutely or over long term. So acutely, let's say we're talking about a loss of glycogen, so that's that, and along with water weight, definitely effective. And then in terms of like a dieting strategy, you really are cutting out one whole macronutrient. So, the most important driving factor when we're looking at, let's say, weight loss is energy balance. I'm not the first person to say that. So with ketogenic dieting, you're cutting out one whole macronutrient profile. So of course you're going to be cutting a lot of calories from your diet, and it's going to make it easier to lose weight. Now in terms of Brianna's work, really good work. So she provided again the ketone monoester and looked over a 4-hour period, so the ghrelin concentrations versus like a dextrose drink. And so what she was able to show was that the ghrelin response was lower with the ingestion of the ketone monoester versus a carbohydrate drink, and the BHB response in the participants was correlated with the reduced desire to eat and increased level of fullness. So now, in terms of, again, mechanism, so that's then established. So moving on from that, it'd be really interesting to see in a population group, so a longer term diet study, is it then when you add it into people's daily life, mixed meals, does that mechanism in an acute laboratory setting carry over to real life? And again, we've touched on it many times. People are probably sick of hearing it. Is it cost effective? Are people actually going to be able to, not even in a study, are people actually who want to lose weight, whether it's just a member of the general public or whether it's an athlete trying to lose weight for a race or competition, are they going to be able to do that on, let's say, a budget that they set aside for, whatever nutritional supplementation practices that they put into place?
So, summarizing everything here, Mark, which contexts, if any, would you think that athletes would benefit more from using exogenous ketones, particularly considering the various moments during a cyclist season, training camps, periods of training with low carbohydrate availability, periods of training with high carbohydrate availability, strength training, weight management to get into race weight, and then finally racing, whether in one-day races or in multi-stage races? Where and when and which teams would you see a good reason to use exogenous ketones?
Yeah, so I think in terms of who would actually benefit from using these supplements, again, based on the data that we have at the moment, to me, the only supplement worth considering at the moment would be the BHB monoester. And then who is it actually aimed for? Who would get a benefit from using it? Well, I think that endurance athletes, so again, we're mainly talking about cyclists here, highly trained, they have a high VO2 max, they have a higher capacity to extract ketones and actually use them as a source of fuel. So it's going to be these guys that are competing in long events. So events that result in severe energy depletion. So even events that, it's hard to ingest or use that amount of carbohydrate supplements as whether it's to get the benefits of another energy source, or whether it's like the more metabolic benefits that we haven't touched on too much. So highly trained guys competing in long events that result in energy depletion. Now, is it budget dependent at the moment? It's a simple answer. I think it is. If you go onto the human website at the moment, HVMN website, a one-time order of 3 bottles of the ester costs $99. So if you're looking to use that as a weight loss strategy, that's going to probably cost you a lot of money. Whereas if you want to use it, try it out as an acute performance enhancing strategy, fire ahead. And see what it does for you. But yeah, I think definitely at the moment, I'm not surprised that the only people that were really talking about using it are, teams with high budgets, or just generally Tour de France teams. And it might be at the moment, based on the research, not there probably isn't enough to back up its use yet in kind of your everyday or kind of the major proportion of athletes that people are dealing with.
And where would you like research to go in the next 10 years, Mark? What do you think is there left to do to get a clearer picture on how ketone supplementation might work and might possibly be applicable to exercise performance, or even to having some clinical applications?
So I think there's a lot of ways that this area could be improved upon, and I think number one is that when people are designing the studies, they really need to think about is this applicable to the real world? Now, there's always going to be a balance between designing a study that's scientifically robust and then that's going to be applicable to practitioners. So you're going to have to give up some things on both sides. But I think that's something that I think could definitely be improved upon. Now, those studies might be quite difficult to do. We found it quite hard to get runners to come in and run on a treadmill for more than a 10K at a high intensity. But I think if people could aim at that, it would really help out. In terms of moving forward, even things like different dosing strategies, like dose response, I'd really like to know if there actually is an optimal ketone range by giving, different dosages of ketones before exercise, and not kind of divvying it out during exercise as well. In terms of recovery, I'd really like to see a really well done, practically relevant glycogen depletion protocol, and maybe a longer term recovery that we haven't seen yet. And then in clinical side of things, I think that's important as well in terms of in cognitive impairment disorder, so things like Alzheimer's disease, using ketogenic supplements alongside a ketogenic diet to help restore people's cognitive ability. That's probably more important than sports performance in the long term. And then also would athletes following a ketogenic diet benefit from using these supplements more than people who are carbohydrate fed? They probably, because they're exposed to ketones more often, have a higher capacity to take them up and use them during exercise. I don't have any data for that. That's just kind of a little bit of intuition. So I think that there's a whole lot of areas where this area could go. But again, like I said before, sports supplements like these don't get long to actually make their mark whether it's in the market or in research. So we really have to strive to do the best quality research that's actually relevant to practitioners, and engage with those practitioners and communicate the results effectively to them and to the public, because it's an area at the moment that is very confused. And even in the last week, obviously with Lance Armstrong's podcast and all the articles coming out, and so much misinformation out there, that I hope there's been people could listen to this and clear things up just a tiny bit.
Mark, so I think we are done here. If people want to keep up with your updates or on social media, for example, or contact you, where can people go to?
Yeah, so my people can contact me on Twitter. So just Mark Evans _17. So if anyone wants to connect through there, that's where they can find me.
Okay, perfect. I will provide these links on the show notes, so people can directly access to Mark's Twitter profile. And Mark, I can only thank you so much for taking the time to be here. This has been incredible. Allow me to congratulate you, Mark, for the amazing research and the contributions you've been giving in this past years, along with Dr. Brandon Egan. And your research was definitely important to make this, confusing topic a little bit less confusing and much more clear. So thank you for that.
No problem. It was a pleasure. And I mean, I wouldn't feel too bad about being confused. I was studying this for, almost 4 years, and I still get confused.
So that was Mark Evans, who recently got his PhD. Clearly a man who knows what he's talking about. And it really was a pleasure interviewing him. I hope you guys took many interesting notes from this episode. Thanks again for taking the time for listening to Fuel the Pedal podcast, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.